Welcome to Stallside Podcast.
Bart, how you doing today?
I'm great, Peter. How are you today?
Yeah, good, thanks. Hey, great guest on the show today.
Yes, indeed. We've got one of the pillars of not just Rood Riddle Equine Hospital, but of veterinary medicine and the racing industry. Dr. Larry Bramlage on with us today. It's going to be a great day.
Yeah, he's a bit of a force of nature, this guy. And you're watching him work and you suddenly realize how inadequate you are in what you do. At least I do.
It is intimidating, I have to admit.
Yeah, but
keeps you humble.
No, I mean, he's like a well-oiled machine. I mean, and again, he's been like a model for me on how to actually do better than I do. And focus on the things which make a difference and drive things forward. And he's had a storied career. I mean, he came along at a time when essentially the specialty of equine referral surgery in practice didn't exist.
Yeah, no, and he for everything that he's done for orthopedics for the horse, I think one of his greatest skills is breaking the complex down into something that very simple minds like mine can understand. He is so good at taking the complex and making it simple. And you'll see that when we talk to him today.
Yeah, and even when you're sitting on rounds with the students and going through a paper, I mean, he always sort of has an opinion or an insight that otherwise we wouldn't have got. I mean, there's a wealth of knowledge there, so it's something to share. So coming up next on Stallside, Dr. Larry Bramledge, equine surgeon and a force of nature. Welcome to Stallside.
Well, it's good to be here.
Thanks for being with us.
Groundhog Day,
It's going to be a baby fall out of the air and you're going to have to catch it. Yeah. So tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, I grew up in Kansas, farm kid, and along through your life, you run into these things where you go one road when you could have chosen another. And I've been really fortunate in the years that I was growing up that there have been influential people that met me at certain points in my career and guided me down one path or the other that turned out for me to end up here. And I'm really thankful for them. I guess it's, when Yogi Berra said, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. So you don't always know that it's a fork in the road, but sometimes it's an intersection and maybe you wouldn't go the direction you went unless somebody influenced you. So I grew up in a small town in Kansas, farming community. My father was a farmer to begin with. And the first person that came along that had a big influence on me was the guidance counselor at my high school. Until that time, you sort of move along, you're making good grades and hoping you can do the best you can to keep your mom and dad off your back. And so I was a junior in high school, and the guidance counselors I can remember it was during football season, and it was a Thursday because I remember the questions he asked me. We used to start school at 7:30, and classes were an hour, and between 11:30 and 12, there was a period where anything could happen. You get called to the office, you might have a meeting, those sort of things. So I got called to the office one day over the intercom, and I was thinking, what on earth? I haven't done anything.
Not today, at least.
Yeah. And so his name was Rex McGugan, and I got to the office, and the secretaries told me, Mr. McGugan wants to see you, so I went to see him. And he sat me down and said, I've been looking at your transcripts and you make pretty good grades, and I know that your parents don't have a lot of money. Have you given any thought to what you're going to do after high school? Well, at that point in time, early in your junior year, you're worried about whether you can win the football game on Friday and if you can get up enough nerve to ask somebody for a date. That's that kind of occupies the junior and high school boys, and me included. So I said to him, I really haven't, because I didn't know, I hadn't thought about what options I had. And so he said, well, go home and think about it and come back on Monday and tell me what you're thinking. So I went home for the weekend. My father worked for a cattle company at that time, and we used to come help him whenever we had spare time. And whenever something would happen and the veterinarian would come, the veterinarian in town was a man named Keith Beeman, who turned out to be a good friend. But he was my Little League coach, and his son was in my class. We were friends, and we played football, baseball, everything together. And so I'd usually go help Dr. Beeman whenever he came, and it just so happened that that occurred that weekend. He had to come out and look at some steer or something for some reason, and so I went to help him get the steer in the chute and all that. And the next Monday I went back to school, and I'd been thinking over the weekend, well, you know, being a veterinarian wouldn't be such a bad job. They drive a nice truck. You know, it's a small town, so there were no doctors in town. We had to go 22 miles to see a doctor. There were some lawyers, but I didn't know any of them. So it was appealing to me, and I said, the more I thought about it, I said, well, it's a good thing. So I went back to Mr. McGugan and said, I think I might like to be a veterinarian. And he said, okay, great. You're an in-state student. You have to go to Kansas State, because at that time, other schools didn't look at in-state students from other states. And plus, the tuition is a lot different, even though it's a lot less than it is now. So I said that to him, and he said, okay. And he gave me some books and said, K-State, here's the information you need to fill out for financial aid. Here are the things you need to do to apply. And he walked me through that. I did the application and got accepted to school, which is not a big deal because you're an in-state student. For undergrad, most people get accepted. And so I started off the veterinary school, and that's how I made the turn in the fork in the road to being a veterinarian. Not that it wasn't appealing to me before. It wasn't kind of a spur-of-the-moment thing, because we'd always had animals whenever we had a small farm. We had cattle and sheep. Cattle and hogs, no sheep. Chickens. I hated the chickens.
I say we had pigs. I hated the pigs. I'd do anything. I hated them.
I didn't mind the pigs. Didn't? But I didn't like cleaning the chicken house. That was awful. So anyway, I went along that path, went to school, got financial aid, thankfully, and he sort of helped me out. Now, I don't want to downplay the role that my mother and father played, because they were very influential in my life. My mother taught us, all six of us, I have 5 brothers and sisters, taught us all to work. And my dad really, I think his biggest influence was the moral character that he tried to instill in all of us, and hopefully did. He had this saying all the time that you can never take back a bad check. And, you know, at that time, there weren't a lot of credit cards. You did most things by writing checks. And if you write a no funds check, well, then it sort of stuck with you. But that saying has a lot of meaning beyond just the checks. You know, if you give up your credibility, you don't get it back. And I've tried to keep that in mind all through my life, as far as if you're lecturing or if you're talking to a client. If I'm telling them something, I want them to know that I'm giving them the best information that I have, that it's credible. And that's also led to what papers we've written. They're usually aimed at determining the prognosis for a condition with surgery or without surgery, that since my area is surgery. So my father had a big influence there. But my parents, they were second or third generation German immigrants. And so neither one of them went to high school. They really basically just worked since they were kids. And, you know, we moved to town when I was 10 years old, but up until that time, we didn't have running water or indoor plumbing or anything on the farm. It was truly a small town farm. You know, we had a wash house where you had to heat your own water, and Mom would make you take a bath. But it was a big deal. Whenever we moved to town and moved into a house with all the modern conveniences, plumbing. So I went off to Kansas State with the support of my parents, and I was very lucky, and I found some good jobs. I worked construction during the summers and was able to pay my way through school. I had loans when I got done, like everybody did, but I pretty much was able to keep most of my debt under control. And I got into veterinary school, luckily, after 2 years. There was no requirement of how many years you had to go. There was requirements on what classes you had to fulfill. And as soon as you had them done and were enrolled in the final group of classes, you could apply. And I did. And luckily, I got in to veterinary school after my second year, which saved me the money of being able to go through school the rest of the way. So I'm going along through veterinary school, had great people in my class. We're still good friends. I just went back to a reunion. Some of my close friends are people I went to veterinary school with. And then I get to my junior year, and I'm sort of at another crossroad. I'm not really thinking about it, but you got to start thinking about that time where you're going to go after you graduate. And the second big influential person that stepped up in my life was the equine medicine and surgery head, a guy named Gene Snyder. And he was, we always got along well, but he knew that I liked horses, and equine was not a big popular rotation in my class. A lot of people didn't like it because there was a lot of after-hours work that you had to do, coming in, treating the horses because the students treated them. And so he asked me if I'd like to go with him one day to the racetrack at Fauner Park in Nebraska, which was about 2.5 hours from the veterinary school at K-State. He had to go up there for some reason to see a veterinarian. So a couple other of us went along with him, and we went up and left early in the morning, and we saw those horses training on the backside, and that was the best thing I'd ever seen. That was the most interesting thing to me. And right there, I knew what I would like to do. I didn't know whether I would ever get to do it, but working on those racehorses was something that intrigued me. And they're such good athletes. They're so well made for their job. And the saying of a horse that's training is jumping out of its skin. That's what the trainers say. And that's when they're really fit. It's really true. They're so fit. They love to run. And we just watched them train. We didn't even go to the races that day, but we watched the horses train in the morning. And then that led to a discussion with Dr. Snyder, and he encouraged me to apply for an internship. And he knew the people at Colorado State because he'd been on staff there. And Dr. Adams, who wrote the original Lameness and Horses book, was still on staff there then. And so I applied there, and luckily, I think probably through Dr. Snyder's influence, I got accepted as an intern at CSU.
So up to that point, though, was your horses, had they entered your, or were you planning on being, was it Dr. Beeman?
No, well, I grew up with cattle. We had horses where my dad worked because if cattle got out, we had a couple of quarter horses to move the cattle, and you could go get them. But I didn't grow up riding horseback. I was not a horse junkie as a kid. I always liked the horses. My grandfather had a retired racehorse, a horse named Buckshot that he had fistulous withers, and whenever we were kids, we thought if we just cleaned it up enough, we had our fingers in those fistulas and everything. I probably still have a brucellosis titer from that, but we would ride him. He soon learned that if he would do nothing, we didn't have saddle, we were riding him bareback. If he would do nothing but trot, we'd lose interest after a while without a saddle. So we couldn't get him to canter most of the time, but he would trot until we got tired, and then we stopped. So I liked horses, but I didn't grow up riding, and so I grew up with cattle with my dad. So I went to CSU, and it's a large animal internship, but it was mostly horses. Most of the food animals there are in feedlots and in the BLM ranges in the mountains. So I went there, had a good time. We saw horses in the morning, appointments, and in the afternoon there were classes that the faculty taught, but the interns were on emergency duty. And when we were on emergency duty, we had to be in the building. Of course, there weren't cell phones or anything at that time, but you couldn't even go home. You had to be in the building for the afternoon and early evening. And so you run out of things to read. And I started spending a lot of time in the post-mortem room and just dissecting horses' legs and looking to see what the anatomy was and how they worked. And I didn't know at that time that was valuable and as valuable information as it is. I mean, I still use some of that information now that I learned back when I was an intern. So I'm now halfway through my internship and decide that maybe I would like to be a resident and be a surgeon. And so I applied for residencies, and I didn't get any. I even got turned down at CSU. They took one of the other interns, and we had a meeting, and the head of the residency program told me that he didn't think that I had the stuff that they wanted in a resident. And that lights a fire under you. I worked my tail off the rest of the time I was an intern. But luckily, during that time, the third big person that influenced me arose, and that is Dr. Gobble, who was the head of the equine section at Ohio State, had a resident quit. And this was about 2 months after the match, so all the available applicants are gone. And so he's worried that he doesn't have a resident that's going to fill that slot for the Ohio State program. So he calls Bruce Heath, who was his resident back whenever earlier than me, and he asked him if there was anybody at CSU that might fill the spot because they needed somebody. And so Bruce said, yeah, I think maybe. And so he came and found me, and I called Dr. Gobble, and we set up an interview, and I went out and interviewed with him, and he offered me the job while we were there. And so that's how I ended up at Ohio State, which, as it turned out, was a very positive influence. And what seemed bad at the time when I didn't get a residency turned out to be one of the best things that could have happened to me, because it opened up this slot, which then led to a lot of other things. So I go to Ohio State and become a resident there. And Dr. Gobble, a lot of us here, Dr. Emerson, Dr. Hubble, Dr. Reed, we were all Gobble students, or as we called them with him, we're either Gobble students or Gobble grand students for the people that we taught. But he was a great mentor. He would never stand in your way of letting you do something, but he would question you subtly, sometimes not so subtly, about, well, do you really think that's going to work? And when we made rounds in the mornings, and so he kept you thinking, but he let us do things that had reasonable chance of being successful on the patients, and that sort of led to my interest in internal fixation, because Ohio State was the mecca for internal fixation of fractures at that time. This was 8 years after the AO group had been formed and held the first course in the United States. The bone plating actually originated, for the most part, it was all around the world, but it became practical with the influence of the Swiss, because they had all of those boot top fractures in their skiers, the tibial fractures, and they in the wintertime they'd have hospitals full of people in traction with fractured tibias. And so that's how the original AO group went to work on finding a way that you could do internal fixation, and they perfected it first. Now, there have been a lot of companies that have imitated their instruments since then, and the whole science has moved forward. But there was a person named Bruce Hohn, who now here's another influential person in my career. He had been at the Hospital for Special Surgery in New York, met some of the MDs there who were working on bone plating. They'd just seen it and had become interested in it. And he's a veterinarian, but a small animal surgeon. And he originated the first AO course in the United States. It happened at the veterinary school, not at a human hospital. And then for a while, the MDs and veterinarians all went to the course together, because basically the basic science, bone anatomy, how bone heals, stability, those sort of things, that crosses all species. And so I attended the 7th course of that, which they were held every year. And then it just so happens the next year, one of the faculty members there left. And he left relatively quickly. And so I get called, Dr. Gobble calls me into his office and said, Dennis is leaving. We need somebody to take his place, and you're it. I didn't interview. I didn't do anything. He just said, I was a second-year resident, and so I hadn't taken the boards or anything yet. Then it took 5 years till you could take the boards. But so I took over the service, and I was seeing cases as a second-year resident, which was, it was a little bit daunting, but it was a real opportunity for me to grow relatively quickly. And then at the same time, Dennis was part of the AO course, so I took over his segment of the AO course. I could never have organized the whole thing, but organizing the equine section in under the umbrella of Bruce Hohn was not that hard. So that was 43 years ago. This year was the 43rd AO course in a row that I've taught. So along the line, we expanded the basic course for horses to now there's a basic and an advanced course, 2 3-day courses. When we started, the long bone fractures, which is the plating, was 1 hour of the course, and now it's a full 3 days that we teach. We teach the basic and advanced every other year. So that gave me another opportunity, and it also was stimulating as far as understanding how bones heal and how you could fix fractures, and the end results were a lot better if you made the fracture stable. So I started working with that, and I spent a little more time in the post-mortem room, and that's how I got the idea for the Fetlock arthrodesis technique that we still use today. And it all came from the fact that I had somehow noticed that the ligaments below the sesamoids don't stretch, and the suspensory ligament above does normally when a horse is exercising. So because of that, whenever you tried to do a Fetlock arthrodesis, you can't really put the plate on the backside because of the anatomy. There's all of the ligamentous attachments are there. You can't detach them to get a plate on. You got to put it on the front side. But I got the idea of using the sesamoid bones to make them stable, to make the ligaments in the back a tension band to help the plate in front become more stable. I mean, it's the same biomechanics as they use for a construction crane when they put the elbow on top and put the big tension band over to make the crane longer. Mm-hmm. Well, you just flip it upside down, and it's the same thing we use to do Fetlock arthrodesis. So I did a couple of horses. I did several in the post-mortem room, and then one came along that needed an arthrodesis, and we used that technique. It worked. So then we went on in the horses that had the ruptured suspensory apparatus where they break their sesamoids, replaced it with a wire or a pair of wires now. And so that became the second version of the technique. And after half a dozen successes, I presented it at the ACVS course, and we started teaching it in the AO course. Now, there was a lot of people, practitioners who were doing orthopedic surgery would come to the AO course, even ones that had graduated some years before, to see what was new and what we were doing. And Bill Reed was one of them. Another person was Bob Copeland, who I'll get to here in a little bit. He's another big mentor of mine. But Dr. Reed was there. The first horse we ever did with a breakdown was for Dr. Copeland and Gary Lavin, who actually just passed away the last year, but he also became a good friend. And they came up and we did the surgery, and it's a pretty long, relatively complicated surgery. It takes us about 3 hours now. That first one took us 5 hours. And we got it together, and we lost her eventually, but not because the fixation was bad, but because she had damaged her blood supply to the foot, and the foot was avascular. So that's still something we have to avoid whenever we're doing that procedure. But that worked mechanically, and then along came a horse named Noble Dancer, who was one of the first $1 million earners when you had to earn $1 million, 50,000 at a time. He was a nice horse in New York, and so he tore his distal sesamoidian ligaments off of the sesamoids, and Dr. Reed calls and said, "Do you think we can use your procedure to do this?" And I said, "Well, we can try and see if we can resolve it." We've done it now on a half a dozen or so. And so we went up and we did it on him, and it worked. He became a stallion. Everything went well. He came here to Lexington to stand for several years. He was a stallion until he was about 20, although he didn't become a premier stallion. He was just one of the stallions that were good, but not great. But he was insured by Lloyd's of London. So now here they have a insurance claim. So I actually began consulting for them, doing this surgery at different places when the horses would get this injury. And we didn't save them all, but we saved quite a few of them. And so that had led to my practice growing. And that was how I first met Dr. Copeland, who after that, he always came to the Ohio State football games. So after we got to know each other, he would come up on Saturday morning and he'd see what we were doing, and I'd go to the football game with him. And then during the spring and the fall meet at Keeneland, I'd always come down and spend a week with him at the racetrack. First of all, it was the first place where I ever saw racehorses train, and it was another chance to do that, but it was a much higher level of horses with him. He taught me so much about people and about horses, and he's still a close friend and valuable mentor. I owe him a lot. My father died in 1984 at the age of 62, and after that, Dr. Copeland has been sort of my surrogate father, taking my own father's place at that time. So that led to lots of opportunities, which the practice was growing at Ohio State. I actually left for a year and went to a private practice in New Jersey. It was a new practice, and the place was nice. The horses were nice. We were close to New York. It had been close enough to Noble Dancer that we were getting cases, and it was working pretty successfully. But I couldn't get along with the person who was the veterinarian who was the head of the surgery. So I got an offer from Dr. Gobble to come back, and when he retired, take over as the head of medicine and surgery at Ohio State, which I did. Came back to Ohio State, and then about 2 years later, this would have been 83, he decided he was going to retire, and so I was able to move into his place. turns out I didn't I thought I had the desire to be the head of a academic unit in a university, but after doing it, I didn't really, I didn't have the patience to do that, the meetings and stuff. And so I did it for 3 years, but eventually I asked to give it up because I wanted to do surgery. And at that time, my practice was growing and I'd begun consulting in Lexington. So I was coming here every Thursday, and it started with Hermitage Farm and then to Bluegrass Farm and then eventually to Lane's Inn. Bluegrass Farm at that time was by far the biggest farm. They had 6 farms in the area. They were breeding about 250 mares. And so Mr. Hunt was the leading breeder several years, and they built a small surgical facility on the back of or behind the house at Bluegrass Farm near the airport, where we did arthroscopies on their yearlings. Their veterinarian, Joe DeMichael, would do the periosteal transections and suture the wounds and stuff, but I would come down and do their arthroscopy. So I was doing that. And in 1986, Bill Rood calls and wants to know if I am interested in moving to Lexington. So I came down to meet with him and Tom, and actually we probably were standing about the same place we are right here, except for we are on the ground, not on the second floor. No buildings, nothing here. They just bought the piece of property. And they wanted to know if I'd be interested in coming down and being the surgeon at their new practice. I agonized over that decision for 2 months. I actually took longer than I probably should have to make the decision. But the difficulty for me was Dr. Gobble, again, was a visionary in saying that you guys have to specialize in either general surgery or orthopedics. The time's going to come when you can't do both. It's too complicated. You're going to have to know how to do. So he had this saying of, if you get really good at something and like to do it, you'll always be okay. And so for me, that was orthopedic surgery. And we had just divided our caseload. Everybody had to still do colics, but I had finally worked the orthopedic caseload up enough that that's all I was doing was orthopedics. And if I'd come here, then I'd have had to go back and do general surgery, urogenital surgery, colics. I did colics when I was here for the first, dozen years or so. I was still doing colics up there. That wasn't a big issue for me, but I wanted to try to continue being an orthopedic surgeon. So eventually I said no, that I wanted to stay at Ohio State for that reason. And that's when they hired Dr. Embertson. And that was a good move for both sides because he does have the people skills and the talent to set up equine surgery unit and section, and he was much better at it than I would have been. And so, but at the same time, I was continuing to grow my orthopedic practice. And then when Rood Riddle actually became a destination, a place where you could do surgery, eventually I came down here full time. Now, what led to that was my wife. Our kids were young. They were 7 and 10. And she said to me that your kids don't know you. I was off to consult for surgery for Lloyd's. I was going one day a week down here. To make things worse, there was a veterinarian in Columbus, Rick Mather, and we had set up a surgical facility. So I was doing arthroscopies that we couldn't get in at school at the university because we couldn't do them enough cases. So I was doing them one night a week and Saturday mornings. And she said, "This can't go on. You got to do something." So I decided to discuss with Dr. Rood coming here, and that's how I ended up coming down here. But in the end, as I said, both sides were better off having Rolf run this thing before I got here, still running it more than I do. because I don't have a patience for administration very much. I'd rather be doing surgery and looking at horses. So that's how I ended up here at Rood Riddle, and we had good success with a lot of the major surgeries. Arthroscopy had come along in '82 was the first time that I did arthroscopy. There was a sort of relatively minor influential person in my life named Frank Noyes, whose wife had hunters, who I was doing the lameness exams on, and they lived in Dayton. He was in the Air Force doing research at the Air Force Base in Dayton, and he got interested in arthroscopy, and he held the first human arthroscopy course in Ohio in Cincinnati. And we had been discussing some problem with his wife's horse. She had a problem in her stifle, and he wanted to know if we ever look inside the stifle. And I said, we wouldn't do an arthrotomy on a stifle. It's too high motion and stuff. And he said, well, we're looking at arthroscopy and think that has a lot of promise. Would you like to come to the course? So he let me come to the first human arthroscopy course in Ohio. And that was basically, there were no cameras. You had to look at the arthroscope like this in the joint. But people were just learning to be able to move around inside the joint, and then that grew into the instruments, and now our treatments are done arthroscopically for the most part. But that was the start. So I was just lucky then to have run on to Frank, who was really influential and a nice guy. And then that got us with the arthroscope at Ohio State. Arthroscopy didn't take off in Lexington right away. It was several years before anybody in Lexington was doing it. So the horses were coming to Ohio State, and that's why Bluegrass Farm built the surgery where we could do the arthroscopy on their yearlings. And then, those horses came here when I came here. So it was good for both sides.
What year did you come here?
1989.
89.
So that was... that I'd had my term as the section head at Ohio State, and as I said, my wife said, then you got to do something different for your kids. And so I came here, and it allowed me to spend more time with my kids. I was able to coach their basketball and baseball and those sort of things.
Yeah, I think the first time I met you, you were in the garage building something for the Boy Scouts.
Oh yeah, that's we built a concession stand as my son's Eagle Scout project for Dunbar High School, and we didn't have a place where I could put it, so I had all the lumber in the hay shed, and I did have a table saw. I brought the table saw in, and we cut up all the pieces.
Yeah.
So no, it turned out to be the right move. Turned out to be the right move to move here because my avocation is surgery. I like doing the research papers and stuff, knowing how the things come out, but benchtop research is not something that really I would have been very good at, I don't think.
So as you look back over your career, what are just a couple cases that, those were kind of hallmarks of your career? Well,
Noble Dancer was one. That's the first big plating that had ever been done. Sort of not ever done in the United States, but was a big success. And when he did well, he got coverage on a lot of media, and that's where I got the invitation to go on Paul Harvey.
Yeah.
And to my mother, that was the pinnacle. It could never get any better than that. That was the highlight of the career. But whenever I was working construction, and it used to be that everything stopped at 12 noon to go listen to Paul Harvey for 5 minutes. And I don't know if there's a New Zealand equivalent to that or not, but everybody knew who Paul Harvey was. And so I did an interview with him on the radio show. So Noble Dancer was a big influence. The next big influence horse that's influential was Personal Ensign. Personal Ensign was owned by the Phippses and trained by Shug McGahee, who still is their trainer. But she had won 2 races in a row as a 2-year-old, and she obviously had a lot of talent. And she fractured her hind first phalanx, split it right down from the fetlock to the pastern joint. And I had met Shug because he trained at Churchill Downs whenever I was doing work for Hermitage Farm, and he was training for Hermitage Farm. So they had a couple of horses that they needed surgery that Shug was training. So that's how I got to know him. And so he calls, actually, the assistant trainer, Buzzy, called and said, at that time I was at a meeting in Chicago and there were no cell phones, so he couldn't call me directly. So they called the office. The secretary there calls the hotel in Chicago and leaves a message. And somebody at the hotel left me a message on the phone. So when I got back that night, the phone was blinking. So I called Buzzy Tinney, was his assistant trainer then, and talked to Shug. And they said, can you come to New York and help with Personal Ensign surgery? And so I got... Bill Reed's hospital was off the backside of Belmont Park, where Ruffian is now, the Ruffian, Cornell Ruffian Center. And that's where we were going to do the surgery. I had some instruments FedExed up from Ohio State to New York, and I went there the next day, and we did her surgery. It went well. She did everything perfectly as far as the rehab. She healed perfectly. She was sound. After the surgery, I said to Shug, I think she might race. He didn't believe me. This is a horse with a fracture. And they were just hoping to save her as a broodmare. I wasn't sure, but it had gone so well that I told him I thought there was a chance. She went through all the rehab. She about halfway through her 3-year-old year. She made her first start, and she won another 11 in a row without ever getting beat. Won the Breeders' Cup. Her race with Winning Colors is still, I think, voted the most exciting race in the Breeders' Cup, because that's when she only led one stride, and that was the last one. She was behind by 100 yards at the top of the stretch, and she just made up the difference and won, which is a storybook ending. 13 in a row for her, and then retire as the champion. That was the first horse who really showed the trainers and the owners that you could do orthopedic surgery and get a high-quality recovery. So I think she led to people trusting us to do surgery on their horses and, put screws in and expect them to come back. And so it used to be that if you did a condylar fracture in a horse and he came back and won, it was a story. But it's no longer the case. The Breeders' Cup 10 days ago, there were 9 races on Saturday. The Japanese won 2. Yeah. The English Godolphin won 2, and 5 horses were won by American horses. 4 of the 5 of those horses had surgery here. 3 of those 5 had condylar fractures that we put screws in, and they all won. And so now it's not even a story. People expect condylar fractures to come back and win, as long as they don't do too much damage when they break. So Personal Ensign led to that. Now there's that she was the first horse that was champion after we had done surgery. She was champion older female. And after her, the next sort of rewarding horse, not because it was such a difficult surgery, and she had a significant injury, was Rachel Alexandra. She had a sort of similar story, 2 wins as a 2-year-old. Her trainer, Hal Wiggins, had never had a grade 1 horse, grade 1 winner. He'd been training for years, nice guy. And she gets a moderate-sized fracture in the front of one of her front ankles, and it wasn't a question of whether we could do the surgery arthroscopically and take it out. The question was whether she could come back fast enough that she could run in the Oaks. And this was just before the Breeders' Cup in the fall of her 2-year-old year. So we did the arthroscopy. We got her rehabilitated. Hal got, I think, 1 start, maybe 2 starts before the Oaks. And she finally got, she was fit by the time of the Oaks, and she wins by 25 lengths. She just ran off and left the most of the horses. And so she comes back and wins the Preakness. She was a really rewarding horse, both from the quality of her recovery, but also, that's Hal's first grade 1 winner. And he retired a couple of years after that because he owned part of her and they sold her for $10 million.
He did it in
to
a
Stone
big way.
Street. Yeah. So, but like most racetrackers, he was retired for a while and he couldn't stand it. So last time I saw him at Churchill, he's back training again. A small group of horses, but the same is for a lot of veterinarians that work on horses. Is you'll see them retire, and then 2 or 3 years later, here their name's on referrals again, and you talk to them and say, "What happened?" "Well, I came back part time and stuff." That doesn't happen in small animal very much. Horses get into people's blood. It becomes a way of life for equine practitioners. I mean, all of us. We go home at 5, but we don't leave the job. You're either thinking about it or you're coming back, or whenever you have a case. And so I think the thing that stays rewarding with people that are working on horses is the validation or the test that happens after all of your treatments occur. If you do a TPLO in a dog and you're counteracting the cruciate injury, getting on the sofa is a good result. But with a horse, race horses or show horses or 4-H horses, if you have a practice where you have kids with 4-H ponies and those ponies come back and win, that's a level of validation that I don't think the other specialties have. And so I really think that's why the equine practitioners tend to retire, and then a lot of them unretire again, and they come back and practice in some other mode to stay connected. So the equine practice is it's an avocation as well as a vocation.
Yeah, it's trite, but they're majestic animals. They're incredible really to be around.
They really are. If I was ever that fit one time in my life, I really would have liked to have been.
You have to know what that feels like.
Yeah. Well, it passed really quickly.
Yeah.
So what does a day look like for Larry Bramledge?
I've been really fortunate in that over the years, it started out as, doing all kinds of surgery and then just doing orthopedic surgery. And then eventually it was just doing orthopedic surgery on racehorses about 15 years ago. So that's all that I do now really is racehorse injuries and problems. We spend 3 days a week doing surgery on horses that are racing or horses that want to race, yearlings in the spring. We have to do all the yearling surgeries, as everyone knows. And in the fall, we're spending most of our time with the horses that are racing. But Tuesdays and Thursdays, we do lameness exams. And, the lameness exams that come here are horses with no pain, heat, or swelling outwardly. If they've got a swollen joint or obvious inflammation in a tendon, the guys at the racetrack pick that up. They're looking at horses every day, and they're good diagnosticians. But there are horses that just go off form. They're not running as well as they were before there's some issue, but they don't have any obvious outward signs. And that's what we do on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Look at those horses. Well, full book is usually 10 every day, and it pretty much is full all the time. When I started out 25 years ago, I didn't particularly like lameness exams. I did them just to get the surgeries. But over the years, I'm sure there's things in medicine, things in reproduction that you keep working with it, and you keep working with it, and pretty soon it starts to become pretty rewarding of you solving those problems that were so perplexing to begin with. That there are people that do the New York Times crossword puzzles every day in order to expand their mind. Dr. Reed does them all the time. And I always say to him, I don't have to do that crossword puzzle. I got 10 puzzles in the barn. I gotta unravel before the days. And it really is that way with a lameness exam. Racehorses are so good at dealing with inflammation and discomfort because they're used to training that the first, unless it's a fracture, the first problem rarely stops them. It'll reduce their form a lot of times, but when they start getting the second problem, they can't handle both of them. And then their racing ability starts going way down, and unraveling which is the most painful problem and which is the most important problem. It's a lot of mental gymnastics, and I have the greatest group of people working with me. I'd be retired a long time ago now if I didn't have Jen Woolery as a secretary. Sherry Miller is a technician now for 21 years, and Amber's been here, I believe, I'm going to get in trouble now, 9 maybe, and then Stacy works with us for pretty much full time now for the last couple of years. They take the load off of me. When I started getting really busy with lameness exams, I went to Dr. Rood and said, I need somebody to work with me that I can ask to do the blocks so that I can keep looking at the horses and I can trust them to block a fetlock if I ask them to. And so that way we can be looking at 3 horses or 4 horses at a time, because each block takes 15 minutes. And while you're waiting on that, you get another horse out to do. And so we decided to keep one of our ex-interns. She's now the CEO. Dr. Spike Pierce was the first person who filled that role. And there eventually were 5. Kathleen Posh and Cynthia Gutierrez. And so we got to the point where ambulatory didn't need any more. They would work for me for like 3 years, and then Dr. Spike Pierce and Dr. Posh, they went on. They were doing the follow-ups on my cases some of the cases while they were working for me, and then eventually they just started doing those all on their own, and then they developed their own practices in the yearling area along that line. And so we still work together, Dr. Posh and I, and now Dr. Thacker, who didn't work for me but did some training with Dr. Garrett. So that went on until we didn't need any more veterinarians, and Sherry Miller had been my tech for, I believe, 6 years. And I came up with the last of these veterinarians. I came up to the room where they were blocking one day, and Sherry was showing the veterinarian how to do the blocks. She'd been holding for blocks for 7 years. She's a licensed technician, bright lady. So she does all the blocks now. Initially, we started her out. Keith Brown had been an ex-intern. He came back. He wanted to spend an extra year. So he came back and filled in that position, but I had an agreement with him. What he had to do was he could get the experience of doing more lameness exams, but he had to be the person that stayed with Sherry doing the blocks, because when I watched her, it'd make her nervous. And so she denies that, but so it was good for her. And initially she started just doing cannon bones, fetlock joints, knee joints, stuff, and I would do the elbows, shoulders, bicipital bursa, stifles. But she's so smart that she kept watching, and pretty soon she's taken over all of those. So she can do them all now, and she teaches our interns how to do them. And I think that's a testament to, like you do in medicine, that veterinary medicine is best in that model. You try to keep everybody working at their highest level of competency. And licensed veterinary technicians can do injections, they can put in catheters, they can do all the stuff that frees us up to be looking at the horses and talking on the phone. Talking on the phone's not terrifically a lot of fun, but it's a necessary part of the job, and, doing the reports and stuff. So that's what my days are like, doing those two things, surgery and lameness exams, and they make it possible for me. All of them are valuable cogs for me.
Yeah, I mean, looking at how your team works has actually been very influential on what we try to do, because you just keep people moving all the time. While you're waiting on one job to cook, you're actually doing another one, and you're a model of efficiency.
Well, that's nice of you to say. I don't like working slow. I mean, I don't like dragging the day out.
Yeah.
We try to get the day done, and then you can either go do something else, or you can go to your office and do something. I don't work well trying to read a paper or do something in between cases. I can't concentrate enough to. So we try to get all the cases done and then go, and they're good at it.
Yep.
It's been good for the practice too.
Yeah, it really
Yeah,
has.
no, it's fabulous.
Yeah, you built a fantastic team. What does the future hold for Larry Bramledge?
I wish I knew. It's still fun for me. It's still fun looking at the program in the Breeders' Cup and seeing how many horses were our patients. I've just had, as most people know, I've had to have my third knee replacement. I have this winter I had a partial in the left knee. My right knee had a total 19 years ago, but the material they were using, the polyethylene then, was reactive, and they didn't know it then. It was state of the art then. But while I was rehabbing my left knee, my right knee prosthesis loosened, so it had to be taken out and replaced. And that's a big deal. I was on crutches for 2.5 months. I really thought maybe that might be it for me, but 2.5 months of not doing anything, I didn't do very well. I was stall walking.
We had to sedate him.
Yeah. At some point, physically, you're not going to be able to do it. I do have some arthritis in my wrist, whether that's it or, at some point, you might wake up in the morning and say, I don't want to do this anymore. But until now, I'm not there. And I'll have to say I do get a lot tireder after doing a full day of surgery than I used to. So some point that's going to happen. And, we got plenty of people in the wings that are learning the same things that we're doing. So life goes on. Dr. Gobble again used to have this saying that one monkey don't stop the show. And so that's pretty accurate. Everybody sort of thinks you're a bigger cog in the wheel than you are. And so.
Well, we're grateful you're still looking forward to doing surgery.
Thank you. It'll last a little while longer, but I don't know how long. So.
Yeah, we're always impressed by how much work you get through. When we look at your list of horses, it's sobering to us mortals.
That's all very flattering. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Right. Well, thanks very much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for being with us. It's been great.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah. And that's Stall Side for this week. We've been with Dr. Larry Bramledge here at Rood Riddle. See you next time.
Got it.
That was great.
Yes.